Why you can't stop sabotaging yourself. Imagine the perfect moment of clarity, the pristine dawn where the plan is flawless, the notebook is open, and the commitment feels absolute. You have, once again, resolved to build the better version of yourself, the one who is disciplined, consistent, healthy, and whole. You feel the surge of potential, the quiet certainty that this time will be different. You are armed with new systems, motivational quotes, and the fresh memory of past failures, ready to use them as fuel. For a glorious, fleeting period, the new habit takes hold. You observe the change, you taste the progress, and you begin to believe the narrative of transformation is finally unfolding. But then an invisible current shifts. It is not a dramatic catastrophe, but a subtle, almost imperceptible erosion. A single skipped workout, an unnecessary indulgence, a crucial conversation deferred until tomorrow. These small deviations feel manageable at first, minor repairs needed on the grand structure. Yet, they are not minor repairs. They are the first tremors signaling the return of an ancient, familiar gravity. Suddenly, the determined self, the one who planned and promised, becomes an alien presence. The self who acts is driven by an entirely different subterranean logic. This is the profound, bewildering paradox of self-sabotage. The moment we achieve proximity to the desired outcome, we initiate the very actions that guarantee our failure. We are rational beings, seemingly compelled to act against our own long-term interests. We spend enormous energy building walls of discipline, only to discover the wrecking ball is being swung from the inside. We are the architect and the arsonist, the healer and the wound inflictor. What is this peculiar internal resistance that seems to possess a greater loyalty to our misery than to our well-being? The common answers, laziness, lack of willpower, moral weakness, are intellectually shallow and profoundly frustrating. They treat the symptom, not the cause. If the problem were merely discipline, we would eventually learn, through sheer repetition of failure, how to stop. But we don't. We loop. We aspire, we ascend, we approach the peak, and then we deliberately choose the descent, landing back in the comfortable, predictable landscape of disappointment. This repetition is what generates the quiet, corrosive despair, the feeling that we are fundamentally stuck, condemned to replay the same cycle of hope and collapse. This cycle is not a failure of character, it is a conflict of identity. We often focus our efforts on changing our behavior, believing that if we just find the right technique, the self will follow. But we fail to recognize that the self is fiercely committed to maintaining internal coherence, even if that coherence is built upon patterns of struggle and limitation. The behaviors we desperately want to change are not the problem. They are merely the visible output of an underlying, deeply entrenched philosophical commitment to who we believe we are. To break the cycle, we must stop asking, "How do I try harder?" and start asking, what hidden self-concept is being protected by this pattern of failure? We must venture beyond the superficial battlefield of willpower and into the silent architecture of belief that governs our lives. The core philosophical concept we must confront is the nature of the self-concept, the internal narrative, the quiet biography we write about ourselves and carry everywhere we go. Self-sabotage is not an absence of effort. It is evidence of a powerful, often unconscious effort to maintain this established narrative. Think of your mind not as a blank slate, but as a meticulously organized library. Every experience, every criticism, every success, and every trauma has been catalogued and used to construct a central organizing principle. This is who I am. This self-concept includes both the flattering attributes and, crucially, the limiting ones. I am the kind of person who struggles with money, or I am the one who is inherently unlovable, or I am the one who always gets close to success but never quite finishes. When we attempt significant positive change, say, finally launching that business or sustaining a truly healthy relationship, we are not just changing a habit, we are challenging the fundamental authority of that library. The system detects a threat. If you suddenly become the person who is financially successful, the old identity of the struggling one must die. And the self, for all its desire for happiness, possesses a greater, almost primal fear, the fear of the unknown. The old, miserable self is known, predictable, and stable. The new, successful self is a terrifying void. The mind prefers the misery it understands to the joy it does not. Therefore, self-sabotage functions as a sophisticated, protective mechanism designed to pull us back into the familiar gravity well of our established narrative. It is the ego's defense attorney, arguing passionately for the status quo. The subconscious does not argue logically, it argues structurally. It says, if you succeed now, everything we know about the world and everything we know about you must be rewritten. That is too dangerous. Return to the familiar pain where the rules are clear. This commitment to narrative coherence explains why the sabotage often occurs right at the cusp of success. If you are 90% toward your goal, the internal tension is at its highest. The moment of completion threatens to shatter the old identity completely. So the mind engineers a spectacular failure, a sudden outburst, a complete relapse, a baffling decision that ensures the old label remains affixed. The self-saboteur, paradoxically, is one of the most dedicated people in the world. They are dedicated to proving their own limiting beliefs correct. They are meticulously collecting evidence to validate the core narrative. See? I told you I couldn't sustain it. I am exactly who I thought I was. The concept we are wrestling with here is the existential weight of being, the terrifying freedom to define oneself anew, and the profound human tendency to retreat from that freedom by clinging to a pre-written script. Philosophical thought has long grappled with this internal schism, viewing the self-saboteur not as flawed, but as profoundly human, a being caught between authenticity and comfort. Consider the existential perspective, particularly the work of Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard spoke extensively about the concept of dread or anxiety, angst, which arises not from external danger, but from the realization of our radical freedom. We are condemned to choose who we are, moment by moment. When we stand on the precipice of true change, we face the anxiety of possibility. The self-saboteur, in this view, is the person choosing inauthenticity, the refusal to accept the terrifying responsibility of defining oneself. It is easier, less terrifying, to fall back into a role, the procrastinator, the victim, the underachiever, because these roles provide a structure, a ready-made narrative that excuses the effort required for true self-creation. The sabotage is, therefore, a strategic retreat from freedom. We prefer the comfortable cage of our limitations because the open sky of infinite possibility is too dizzying. Similarly, Friedrich Nietzsche explored the concept of the will to power, not as dominance over others, but as the fundamental drive to overcome oneself, to perpetually redefine and elevate one's being. The self-saboteur is exhibiting a weakened will to power. They are succumbing to the inertia of cultural expectation and internalized limits. They are failing to become the Übermensch, overman they could be, choosing instead the safety of the last man, content with mediocrity and comfort. The sabotage is the refusal to transcend. Even stepping briefly into Jungian psychology, we encounter the concept of the shadow self, the repressed aspects of ourselves, often containing immense potential, but also deep shame and fear. When we try to become too good or too perfect too quickly, the shadow rebels. The sabotage can be the shadow's way of demanding recognition. You cannot simply discard the messy, flawed, real parts of you. We are all integrated. And by failing perfectly, the individual maintains a sense of wholeness, albeit a dysfunctional one, preventing the traumatic integration of a radically new, idealized self. From these perspectives, the act of self-sabotage is a profound philosophical statement, a declaration that the cost of becoming who we truly could be is currently perceived as higher than the cost of remaining who we are. It is a decision made in the depths of the soul, prioritized over the superficial desires of the conscious mind. How does this philosophical commitment to a limiting identity manifest in the messy reality of daily life? It plays out most vividly in the moments immediately following a major breakthrough or success. Consider the individual who finally receives the promotion they worked years for, only to start arriving late, missing deadlines, and alienating their new team until they are demoted or quit. Or the person who, after months of emotional vulnerability, finally finds a loving, stable partner and immediately manufactures a crisis, an argument, an accusation, a withdrawal that guarantees the relationship's demise. The external world sees baffling irrationality, but internally, the self-concept is screaming. This success does not fit the narrative. If your identity is predicated on the belief that you are perpetually struggling or unworthy of ease, then achieving ease creates profound cognitive dissonance. The mind must restore equilibrium, and since it is easier to destroy external circumstances than to fundamentally restructure internal beliefs, the external circumstances must be destroyed. This phenomenon is often seen in health goals. An individual successfully loses weight and finally feels confident, but this confidence clashes violently with the deep old belief that they are fundamentally flawed or invisible. The mind reacts by triggering a binge or a complete abandonment of the diet. The sabotage ensures the return to the familiar identity. The body and mind return to a state that confirms the internal narrative of limitation. The individual is not sabotaging the diet. They are sabotaging the identity that the successful diet would create. The same dynamic applies to financial stability. If a person identifies strongly with the trauma of scarcity, suddenly having a comfortable savings account can feel deeply unstable. The mind, seeking the familiar pattern of crisis, might orchestrate an impulsive, ruinous purchase or a poor investment decision. The money is gone, the crisis is back, and the identity of the one who struggles with money is safely restored. The behaviors, the overspending, the emotional eating, the career derailment are not random acts of weakness. They are ritualistic, unconscious sacrifices made at the altar of the established self-concept, ensuring that the self remains precisely where it believes it belongs. The true work of breaking the cycle of self-sabotage begins not with action plans, but with radical inner reflection and a profound inquiry into the self-concept we are currently defending. We must move beyond the superficial symptoms and identify the core limiting beliefs that our sabotage is designed to preserve. This requires a gentle, non-judgmental excavation of the internal archive. Ask yourself, if I were to achieve the success I truly desire, the stable relationship, the financial freedom, the physical health, what core belief about myself would be proven false? What comfort would I lose? Often, the comfort is not ease, but the right to be excused. If you succeed, you lose the ability to say, I couldn't do it because... The failure, paradoxically, grants a certain kind of protection from the demands of realized potential. Begin by identifying your recurring narrative statements. When you fail, what is the internal commentary? Is it, I am not strong enough, or I am fundamentally flawed, or good things never last for me? Write these down. These are the identity statements your sabotage is defending. Then ask the crucial transformative question, What purpose does this belief serve? Does it protect you from the fear of greater failure? Does it keep you safe from criticism? Does it maintain a familiar connection to past experiences or family patterns? This reflection reveals that the sabotage is not malice, it is misguided loyalty. It is the subconscious attempting to protect a fragile, established sense of self. The inner work is to consciously choose to dismantle the limiting identity piece by piece and to tolerate the anxiety that comes with the void. This means practicing identity incongruence, acting in ways that fundamentally contradict the old self-concept and sitting with the terrifying feeling that you are acting out of character. If you believe you are the one who always fails, you must choose to finish the task, not just once, but repeatedly, until the evidence of your new behavior begins to overwrite the old narrative. This is the moment where philosophy becomes practice. The conscious, deliberate choice to define your existence by your potential, not your history. The ultimate insight lies in recognizing that the self is not a fixed monument carved in stone, but a continuous, fluid act of creation. The reason you cannot stop sabotaging yourself is because you have been trying to change the script without changing the author. You attempted to impose new behaviors onto an old, resistant identity. True, lasting transformation is not achieved through incremental behavioral changes, but through a radical, philosophical shift in self-perception. It is the courageous decision to kill the limiting identity, to consciously declare that the old biography is complete and that the author of your life is now writing from a place of radical, untethered freedom. This means embracing the anxiety that Kierkegaard described, accepting the terrifying responsibility of being the one who chooses. The solution to self-sabotage is not more discipline, it is profound self-acceptance of the potential for greatness, followed by the willingness to endure the cognitive dissonance of being a new person in an old world. When the moment of temptation arrives, that familiar pull toward the comfortable failure, you must recognize it not as a demand for weakness, but as a test of your new identity. The question is no longer, can I resist this behavior, but does the person I am becoming do this? If you define yourself not as the struggling one, but as the one who is inherently worthy of ease, joy, and success, then the destructive behaviors lose their protective function. They become unnecessary to the new self-concept. The cycle ends when the internal logic that demands failure is replaced by an internal logic that demands authenticity. The final lingering question we must carry into our lives is this: what would I do today, right now, if I truly believed I was already the person I am striving to become? The moment you act from that future identity, the past loses its power and the gravitational pull of self-sabotage finally dissolves. The freedom to become is always available, waiting only for the courage to define it. Moving from the internal architecture of identity to the external theater of daily life, we encounter the subtle, pervasive ways our self-concept dictates our interactions with the world. A powerful and often devastating application of identity conflict occurs within our social ecosystems. When you initiate profound change, you're not simply transforming yourself in isolation. You are changing your role within your established community. Consequently, we see a parallel dynamic to internal sabotage. Social sabotage, where the fear of outgrowing one's circle becomes a powerful driver of regression. Imagine a group of friends whose primary bond is built upon shared habits of complaint, procrastination, or unhealthy indulgence. If one member successfully adopts a disciplined routine, finds genuine contentment, or achieves financial stability, this success acts as a destabilizing force. The successful individual suddenly threatens the group's collective narrative of shared struggle. The mind, deeply wired for social belonging and fearful of isolation, views this ascension as a potential exile. The self-sabotaging behavior, a sudden lapse back into old habits, a return to the shared negativity, or an unnecessary emotional drama, serves the purpose of restoring social equilibrium. It is a subconscious sacrifice of personal progress made to maintain the comforting warmth of shared familiarity. The tragic irony is that we often choose the security of communal mediocrity over the terrifying loneliness of individual excellence. Building on this observation, consider the application in regulating our internal emotional landscape. Many individuals, particularly those who have experienced past trauma or instability, possess a deeply entrenched, often low, emotional thermostat. Their identity is inherently linked to a certain level of manageable anxiety, struggle, or low-grade stress. When genuine, profound happiness or smooth, sustained success arrives, it generates an intense, unfamiliar emotional pressure. This feeling of radical ease feels unstable and dangerous, triggering an alarm in the subconscious that equates profound joy with impending catastrophe. The mind, seeking the familiar equilibrium, will then orchestrate a self-sabotage event, a manufactured fight, a sudden binge, or a reckless financial decision, specifically designed to crash the system back down to the familiar, safe temperature of manageable misery. The sabotage here is not a failure of will, but a successful, misguided attempt at emotional regulation, prioritizing stability, even negative stability, over the perceived risk of sustained joy. Furthermore, examine the common dilemma of chronic, high-stakes procrastination, particularly amongst creative professionals or academics. This is rarely about laziness. It is often the ultimate act of protecting the identity of potential. An unfinished novel, an unlaunched business, or an unsubmitted thesis retains infinite perfect possibility. It is safe from criticism and embodies the idealized genius the individual believes they could be. Finishing the project, however, exposes it to the harsh light of reality, making the potential finite, measurable, and subject to external judgment. Sabotage, manifested as delay or perfectionism that prevents completion, is the mind's desperate strategy to preserve the self-concept of the brilliant but untested idealist. They sacrifice productivity and tangible success to maintain the comforting, untouchable identity of the person who could have done great things. Consequently, these instances reveal that the mechanisms of self-sabotage are deeply embedded in our relational and emotional needs. They are not random acts of self-destruction, but highly strategic maneuvers designed to manage anxiety. The anxiety of social displacement, the anxiety of unfamiliar happiness, and the anxiety of potential being defined and judged. To break these cycles, we must develop a profound tolerance for the discomfort of incongruence, the feeling of acting out of character, socially and emotionally. This requires consciously choosing to build new social support systems that affirm the emerging self, and deliberately allowing the emotional thermostat to rise, sitting with the strange, destabilizing feeling of genuine, unearned ease. The true test of transformation is not conquering the task, but conquering the overwhelming loyalty to the familiar ecosystem of the past. A distinct, often overlooked layer of self-sabotage connects directly to a deeply ingrained, almost moralistic need for atonement. Consider the individual who carries a heavy internalized burden of guilt, perhaps stemming from real past mistakes, or perhaps from the relentless, hypercritical voice established in childhood that insists they are fundamentally unworthy. When genuine success, ease, or unconditional love enters their life, it creates an intense internal disequilibrium. The subconscious mind, operating under a primitive, punitive logic, believes that suffering is the necessary price for existence, or that joy must be earned through hardship. Consequently, The moment prosperity arrives, it feels like an illegitimate gain, an unfair advantage that must be corrected. The subsequent self-sabotage, the reckless spending, the sudden argument, the abandonment of the health routine is not an accident. It is a meticulously executed, if unconscious, act of self-punishment. The individual is settling an internal moral score, crashing their life back to a level of suffering that aligns with their entrenched belief that they are undeserving. The failure restores a perverse sense of cosmic justice, confirming the deeply held identity of the flawed one who must struggle. Moreover, observe this dynamic when excellence itself becomes the source of anxiety, a phenomenon particularly acute in professional environments. Many highly competent individuals find themselves engaging in what might be termed the competence retreat. After achieving a significant visible success, a stellar project delivery, a record-breaking sales quarter, or an acclaimed public presentation, they deliberately introduce minor flaws or underperform on the subsequent task. This is not motivated by laziness, but by a strategic internal calculation designed to manage expectation. The pressure attached to being consistently perfect is immense and often unsustainable. By achieving a perfect score, the individual raises the benchmark so high that the possibility of future failure feels catastrophic. Sabotage, in this context, is a calculated attempt to lower the ceiling of expectation, allowing the individual to retreat to a level of performance that is merely very good instead of flawless. They are sacrificing the identity of the untouchable genius to regain the psychological freedom of being human, managing the perceived threat of unrelenting scrutiny and burnout. Another crucial layer is revealed in the seemingly innocuous realm of decision-making. We often mistake chronic indecision or commitment phobia for careful consideration, yet it frequently functions as a powerful mechanism of identity preservation. If you perpetually postpone the irrevocable choice, the career change, the relocation, the deeper commitment in a relationship, you successfully avoid defining yourself fully. The individual who delays committing to a single creative path maintains the comfortable, infinite identity of potential polymath or unrealized artist. Choosing one path, however, forces the death of all other possibilities, demanding that a single specific identity be embraced. The ensuing decision paralysis, which guarantees stagnation and prevents forward momentum, is actually a highly effective self-sabotage strategy. By refusing to choose, the individual prevents the definition of a new self that might fail, might be judged, or might not live up to the spectacular, idealized potential they currently embody. Inaction becomes the perfect shield against the terrifying clarity of self-definition, keeping the self safely encased in the realm of comfortable might-be. Consequently, these real-world applications demonstrate that the identity conflict is not abstract. It determines the contours of our daily reality. The sabotage patterns are highly tailored and specific, meticulously designed to protect the most fragile aspects of the self-concept, whether that is guarding against the anxiety of undeserved happiness, managing the crushing weight of external expectations, or defending the boundless yet ultimately hollow promise of uncommitted potential. To truly break the cycle, one must perform an archaeological dig into the emotional and professional landscape, identifying precisely which form of internal comfort, be it moral atonement or protected potential, the self is fighting to preserve. The behaviors will only change when the underlying protective function is consciously decommissioned and replaced with a commitment to a new, more resilient form of self-worth. Now, having illuminated the strategic function of self-sabotage, its hidden loyalty to an established, albeit limiting identity, the essential next step is to initiate a radical internal audit. This is not about shaming the reflexive patterns, but about bringing the subconscious contract into the light of conscious review. We must become meticulous detectives of our own internal language, for the deepest roots of the self-concept are often woven into the very syntax of our self-talk. Turn your attention to the specific verbs and nouns you apply to your failures. There is a profound, life-altering difference between saying, "I performed poorly on that task," and declaring, "I am a failure." The first statement addresses a discrete, changeable event. The second is an act of philosophical essentialism, cementing a temporary setback into a permanent definition of being. When the failure happens, does your internal voice use nouns to label your character? "I am lazy," "I am broken," or does it use verbs to describe the action? "I delayed," "I miscalculated." The self-saboteur's identity is reinforced every time an action is converted into an unchangeable attribute. A powerful practice involves consciously de-essentializing these internal labels, forcing the mind to describe only the behavior, thereby separating the transient act from the immutable self. Beyond the mere words, we must scrutinize the concept of temporal infidelity, the mechanism by which the present self actively undermines the future self. When you choose the immediate comfort of the old habit, you are making a stark ethical decision. You are betraying the self who will inherit the consequences of your current choice. This future self, the one who needs the finished project, the healthy body, the stable relationship, is a distinct entity deserving of respect. Try visualizing this future self not as an abstract ideal, but as a specific person. Interview them, understand their needs, and recognize the specific pain you are inflicting upon them with your current choices. This reframing transforms self-sabotage from a private lapse in discipline into an act of direct harm against a loved one. A rhetorical device that often possesses far greater motivational power than mere self-criticism. Furthermore, consider the origin of your core limiting beliefs. Many of the most rigid components of our self-concept are not actually self-authored. They are inherited narratives, borrowed identities, absorbed from family dynamics, early social environments, or cultural expectations. We may be living out a script written decades ago for a parent, a sibling, or even a societal role model. For instance, you might carry the unspoken conviction that ambition leads to isolation, or success requires unbearable sacrifice simply because that was the lived experience modeled for you. True introspection demands that you identify these foreign scripts and ask, "Do I truly believe this? Or am I merely loyal to the story I was handed?" This realization allows you to begin the process of consciously repatriating your identity, separating the voice of your authentic desire from the echo of generational fear. A practical exercise to reveal this loyalty is the assessment of your identity tax. Every established identity, even the negative ones, comes with a set of unconscious compensations or entitlements. If you maintain the identity of the struggling artist, for example, the tax you pay is lack of income, but the hidden compensation might be the entitlement to spend your time freely, or the avoidance of complex business logistics. If you maintain the identity of the overburdened martyr, the tax is burnout, but the compensation is the constant validation and sympathy received from others. Map the tax, the obvious cost, against the hidden compensation. Until you consciously recognize and choose to forfeit that subtle, often pathetic reward, the self-sabotaging behavior will remain functional and necessary to your internal economy. Only when the compensation is consciously devalued can the old identity begin to lose its grip. This is the moment where silent observation transforms into radical self-determination, preparing the ground for the creation of a new, resilient self. Drawing these strands of inquiry together, the narrative shifts from a question of personal failure to a recognition of sophisticated internal strategy. We are no longer observing accidental lapses in judgment, but the highly functional maneuvers of a deeply conservative self, fiercely dedicated to maintaining the integrity of its own mythology. The cumulative implication of this philosophical excavation is clear. The battleground for self-mastery is not one of brute force against bad habits, but one of conceptual warfare against entrenched self-definition. The futility of past efforts stemmed from the fundamental misdiagnosis. We were attempting to repair the facade while ignoring the foundational architecture beneath. Reflecting on this journey so far, we confront the uncomfortable truth that our most persistent patterns of struggle are, in a strange twist of existential logic, our most loyal servants. They are the psychological anchors deployed to stabilize the ship of self against the terrifying high winds of genuine sustained change. When we attempt to ascend to a higher plateau of achievement or emotional fulfillment, the internal system registers not progress, but threat. The threat of isolation from familiar suffering, the threat of unearned ease, and the threat of invalidating the very core narrative that has structured our existence up until this point. The sabotage, viewed through this lens, is merely the mechanism by which the mind attempts to restore its preferred, albeit limited, state of equilibrium. This profound realization necessitates a complete re-evaluation of how we approach change. The old models demanded an impossible level of continuous effort against a force that was, in essence, ourselves. The path forward demands an act of conscious forfeiture, the willingness to tolerate the anxiety that arises when we deliberately withhold the compensation the old identity demands. We must become comfortable inhabiting the liminal space of identity incongruence, enduring the strange, disorienting feeling of acting out of character until the new pattern of being solidifies into a new, self-affirming truth. This means accepting the loss of the familiar landscape, choosing to stand exposed in the void created when the protective function of failure is decommissioned. The resistance we encounter is not a sign of weakness, but a measure of the profound existential gravity of the past. It is the friction generated when the present self attempts to unilaterally betray the inherited loyalties and temporal contracts established over a lifetime. To move beyond this perpetual cycle, we must pivot from merely observing the destructive behavior to recognizing the precise, specific form of comfort or protection that behavior provides. The ultimate barrier is not the difficulty of the task, but the willingness to let go of the right to be excused, the right to remain safely undefined, or the right to self-punishment that aligns with an internalized sense of unworthiness. As we turn toward the final insight, the focus sharpens on the ultimate act of philosophical courage. We recognize that the self is not a thing to be discovered, but a project to be continuously authored. The chronic cycle of self-sabotage is broken not by finding a better technique, but by executing a decisive internal coup, an intentional overthrow of the old regime of belief. This prepares us to confront the core question of definition. Who are you, now that you understand the protective function of your own limitations? The answer, as we shall see, lies in a radical recommitment to the authentic act of being, liberating the self from the tyranny of its own history. This final step transforms the understanding of why we fail into the clarity required to finally define ourselves by our potential. The profound realization that emerges from this deep dive into the cycle of self-sabotage is that the recurring pattern of failure is not a flaw in our machinery, but a testament to the powerful, often misplaced loyalty of the human mind. We have been fighting a war of attrition against our own behavior, when the true enemy was the comfort derived from the established narrative of who we are. The self-saboteur is not weak. They are profoundly committed to proving the validity of their internal biography, no matter the cost to their external future. The cycle persists because the pain of failure is less terrifying than the existential dread of becoming someone new, someone who must face the world without the predictable shield of their own limitations. To break free, we must embrace a fundamental philosophical shift, the understanding that we are not defined by what has happened to us, but by the conscious choices we make about who we will be. This transition is not instantaneous. It requires recognizing the precise moment the old identity attempts to reassert its authority. It is in the tension of that moment, when the urge to retreat to the familiar failure is strongest, that the true work of self-authorship begins. We must learn to sit with the terrifying anxiety of identity incongruence, the feeling of acting out of character, and recognize that this discomfort is the sound of the old self dying. The enduring insight is that freedom is not merely the absence of external constraint. It is the internal courage to define oneself against the inertia of history. When the temptation to sabotage arises, the question is no longer one of willpower, but of fidelity to the self we are striving to become. Does the person who is worthy of success, of ease, of stable relationships engage in this act? By consciously acting from the desired future identity, we begin to starve the old narrative of the evidence it needs to survive. We are no longer trying to fix a broken self. We are deliberately creating a new one, choosing to validate potential over history. The true practice begins now in the quiet, unobserved decisions of the everyday. It is in the willingness to tolerate the unfamiliar stability, to accept the unearned joy, and to consciously forfeit the perceived compensation that the limiting identity provided. This is the ultimate act of philosophical self-determination. To look at the patterns that have held you captive and declare, not with anger but with quiet conviction, that your loyalty to your potential is greater than your loyalty to your past. The cycle of self-sabotage dissolves not through strenuous effort, but through the calm, resolute declaration of a new identity. Choose to define yourself not by what you failed to do, but by the relentless, quiet courage to become.